One make a distinction between anti-colonial, decolonial, and post-colonial?
I think there are three concepts there which needs unpacking and defining for for purposes of clarity and the understanding of what decolonization is. When we talk about anti-colonial, we are talking really about the struggles, the physical struggles, which were prosecuted against an observable physical empire. That was anti-colonial. And the limits of anti-colonial is that the withdrawal of the physical empire is taken as the end of colonialism. And more often than not, the problem is that those who take over, they generally do not change the institutions, the structures, and all what is inherited from colonialism, they carry over from where they left. So that's where anti-colonial is not decolonial. Decolonial then comes in as a more radical part, which actually targets the structural, the systemic, and the institutional, and it targets them for change. That really you change the institutions which were introduced by colonialism, you change the structures which were introduced by colonialism, you change even the intersubjective relations which were introduced by colonialism, rather than to turn them upside down. That the colonizer was up, and now the African becomes up. If you do that, we have not destructured. We have just turned the scale upside down. So that's the limits of anti-colonial. But they are related, as you can tell. Anti-colonial was supposed to, if it is genuine, it was supposed to culminate in decolonial. The post-colonial is something else. The post-colonial emerges particularly in the 1990s. It emerges at a time when the Marxist thinking was now delegitimized. The nationalist projects were no longer thought of as the right way to take us into the future. That's when you have the emergence of the post-colonial. And the foundational text in post-colonial thinking is the work of the Palestinian scholar Edward Said, and his book published in 1978, Orientalism. That is this text which is always referred to as inaugurating the post-colonial. And the post-colonial raised a number of debates. The first one is, does post-colonial means after colonialism? And I think the most sophisticated answer is that post-colonial does not mean after colonialism. It means the continuation of colonialism, reproduction of the colonial structures, logics within what Achille Mbembe will call the post-colony. So the post-colony, if you look at it carefully, it becomes continuity in discontinuities. When colonialism is said to have discontinued, post-colonialism see continuities in that.
Colonized people are not alone. Despite the efforts of colonialism, their frontiers remain permeable to the news and rumors. They discover the violence is atmospheric. It breaks out sporadically, and here and there sweeps away the colonial regime. The success of this violence plays not only an informative role, but also an operative one. The great victory of the Vietnamese people at Dien Bien Phu is no longer strictly speaking to a Vietnamese victory. From July 1954 onward, the colonial peoples have been asking themselves, what must we do to achieve a Dien Bien Phu? How should we go about it? A Dien Bien Phu was now within reach of every colonized subject. The problem was mustering forces, organizing them, and setting a date for action. This pervading atmosphere of violence affect not just the colonized, but also the colonizers who realize the number of latent being fools. The colonial governments are therefore gripped in a genuine wholesome panic. Their panic is to make the first move, to turn the liberation movement to the right and disarm the people. Quick, let's decolonize. Let's decolonize the Congo before it turns into another Algeria. Let's vote a blueprint for Africa. Let's create the communicate for Africa. Let's modernize it for God's sake. Let's decolonize. Let's decolonize. They decolonize at such a pace that they force independence on a province that I can't pronounce. In answers to the strategy of a being food defined by the colonizer replies with the strategy of containment, respecting the sovereignty of the nations. Welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, and I am continuing my reading of chapter 1 of Frantz Fanon's book, Wretched of the Earth. And chapter 1 is on violence. I'm picking up on page 30 when we're talking about using violence as a means to decolonize a people, mainly African people. And of course, we want to take this information and translate it to where we are right now in 2024 in America, right? And so you see the opening video was talking about colonialism, anti-colonialism, decolonialism, and post-colonialism, because it lines up with what we're talking about here in this chapter, in the latter part of this chapter. What happens after you overthrow the government? What happens after you gain your freedom? What happens then? Because we talk a lot about gaining our freedom on this channel. We talk a lot about it, but we also talk about being united, being structured, being organized before you are mobilized. So after you gain your freedom, you can build yourself up. You have to build as a nation. We talk about the work that we have to put in, because after you become free, you got to go to work. That's when the hard part starts, because now you have to build yourself up as a nation, because at this point, you won't have the resources and the lifestyle and all of the things, the infrastructure that went into your lifestyle. You won't have that because you are now free. So you have liberated yourself from everything that your colonizer was giving you and taken from you, right? You liberated yourself. But now, how do you build your nation? How do you protect yourself? How do you sustain yourself? How do you feed yourself? How do you build yourself, right? All of these questions have to be asked, because it's not just about gaining your freedom. It's about what happens after you become free, and how do you become a national power, becoming powerful. That's why I'm always talking about gaining and building real power, aggregating wealth, aggregating resources. See, Black America, we're in a different position than a lot of the nations that they're talking about in this book, because we know if Black America actually aggregates our power or our resources, we have enough capital to do some things to sustain ourselves. But the problem is we are disconnected. So let's say a small faction of us is able to remove ourselves from under the thumbs of white supremacy. We still would be a third, fourth, fifth world nation, because we don't have any infrastructure, any resources to really build ourselves up from. So therefore, we once again become vulnerable. So that's post-colonialism. So let's pick back up and let's get into this, because we need to think about this fully when we're talking about decolonizing ourselves, or as we say in our terms for 2024 in America, becoming liberated, becoming free of white supremacy. But let us return to this atmospheric violence, this violence rippling under the skin. We have seen as it develops how a number of driving mechanisms pick it up and convey it to an outlet. In spite of the metamorphosis imposed on it by the colonial regime and tribal and regional conflicts, violence continues to progress. The colonized subject identifies its enemy, puts a name to all of his misfortune, and casts all of his exacerbated hatred and rage in this new direction. But how do we get from the atmosphere of violence to setting violence in motion? What blows the lid? First of all, is the fact that such a development has a certain impact on the colonist state of bliss. The colonist who knows the colonial subject realizes from several pointers that something is in the process of changing. The good natives became scarce, since silence falls when the oppressor approaches. Some looks hardened, and attitudes and remarks are downright hostile. The nationalist parties become restless, call for more meetings, and at the same time, security is increased and troop reinforcements are dispatched. The colonists, especially those isolated on their farms, are the first to become alarmed. They demand drastic measures. The authorities do in fact take drastic measures. They arrest one or two leaders, organize military parades, maneuvers, and flyovers. These demonstrations of military power, these saber-rattling exercises, this smell of gunpowder which now fills the atmosphere does not intimidate the people. These bayonets and heavy gunfire strengthen their aggressiveness. A dramatic atmosphere sets in where everyone wants to prove he is ready for anything. It is under these circumstances that the gun goes off on its own, for nerves are on edge. Fear has set in and everyone is trigger happy. The trivial incident and the machine gunning begins. You have a strife in Algeria. You have the central quarries in Morocco and the Moramanga in Madagascar. So we're talking about when the moment before the violence happens to when the violence is happening, right? So the build up, what leads up to the violence? What makes the violence happen? What makes the uprising happen, right? What makes the fighting back happen? Well, we know the inspiration, but we're talking about practically doing it. What's the initial spark to the confrontations? Far from breaking the momentum, repression intensifies the progress made by the national consequences. From the movement, national consequences reaches the embryonic stage of development. It is reinforced by the bloodbath of the colonies, in which signifies that between oppressors and oppressed, force is the only situation. Because at this point, the idea is violence is the only way we can free ourselves from oppression. We should point out here that it is not the political parties who called for the armed insurrection or organized it. All these preparations of repression, all these acts committed out of fear are not what the leaders wanted. These events catch them off guard because the leaders want to be diplomatic. Because the leaders sometimes may have interests on both sides, so they want to be diplomatic. It is then that the colonial authorities may decide to arrest the nationalist leaders. But nowadays, the governments of colonist countries know perfectly well that it's highly dangerous to deprive the masses of their leader. For it is then that the people hurl themselves headlong into jacqueries, mutinies, and bestial murders. These masses give free rein to their bloodthirsty instincts and demand for liberation of their leaders, whose difficult job it will be to restore law and order. Because you're going to get chaos. You're going to get chaos when you take the leaders away. You're going to get dismay and chaos. But it's also strategic because you won't have real direction. You won't have organized thoughts. You won't have true threats as of something that can actually take you down. You have scattered threats that you can douse out and you can put out. It's like scattered fires and you just put them out, right? The colonized who spontaneously invested their violence in the colonial task and the colonial task of destroying the colonial system soon find themselves chanting the passive sterile slogan, free X or Y. The colonial authorities then free these men to start negotiating. The time for dancing in the streets has arrived. Sound familiar? Does this sound familiar? Does this sound like 2020? This sound like BLM, right? In other cases, the political party apparatus may return intact. But in the interplay of colonial repression and spontaneous reaction by the people, the parties find themselves outnumbered outmaneuvered by the militants. The violence of the masses is pitted against the occupiers' military forces. The situation deteriorates and festers. The leaders still at liberty are left on the sidelines, suddenly rendered helpless with their bureaucracy and their reason-based agenda. They can be seen attempting the supreme imposture of a regarded action by speaking in the name of the muzzled nation. As a general rule, the colonial authorities jump at this piece of good fortune, transform these useless characters into spokesmen, and then the next time grant them independence, leaving it up to them to restore law and order. Come in y'all stuff, take y'all stuff, mess y'all stuff up. All right, you want to fight for your freedom? Get your freedom, but now you got to clean your mess up. Oh, and here your leaders go too. We arrested your leaders, caused a lot of dismay, but here your leaders go. We know you need your leaders. Here your leaders go. But clean your own mess up now. Clean your own mess up. You're free. You're free. Now what? You think you're free. Remember Haiti? What happened in Haiti is a great example. Yes, Haiti became the first free Black nation in the Western Hemisphere. But after they became free, what happened? Where are they now? What Frantz Fanon is talking about is what happened in Haiti. But this is why we need to learn this information, know what happened in the past, know what our scholars are teaching us. So when we go for our liberation, we have true liberation. And then when we free ourselves, we can grow. We can become powerful. We have power. We have real potential power. Real potential power, not just a idealized potential power, but real potential power. What in fact constitutes this violence? As we have seen, the colonized masses intuitively believe that their liberation must be achieved and can only be achieved by force. What aberration of the mind drives these famished, enfeebled men lacking technology and organizational resources to think that only violence can liberate them faced with the occupiers' military and economic might? Good question, right? How can they hope to triumph? Since what is scandalous is that violence can be used as a party slogan and the people urged to rise up in an armed struggle, this issue of violence needs to be given careful consideration. When German militarism decides to resolve its border problems by force, it is no surprise. But when the Angolan people, for instance, decide to take up arms, when the Algerians reject any method which does not include violence, this is proof that something has happened or is in the process of happening. The colonized people, the slaves of the modern times, have run out of patience. They know that such madness alone can deliver them from colonial oppression. Now that's important. We are nowhere near that point. There may be groups of us, well, we're nowhere near that point because this is not something constantly we work toward. That happens when the media and white America make us react that way. You notice every time we have such an uprising or a revolt, it's because it's a reaction to what the media has shown us or told us. They know that such madness alone can deliver them from colonial oppression. A new type of relationship is established in the world. The peoples of the third world are in the process of shattering their chains. And what is extraordinary is that they succeed, right? In this age of the Sputnik, we might think it is ridiculous to die of hunger, but for the colonized masses, the explanation is more down to earth. The truth is that no colonist country today is capable of mounting the only form of repression which would have a chance of succeeding, i.e., a prolonged and large-scale military occupation, right? Yeah, we want to do this. We can do this, but we got a better plan. We got a better idea. We'll give you the illusion of freedom. We'll give you the illusion of freedom. We'll give you the illusion of liberation. We don't really want to fight y'all. Why do we need to fight y'all when we got this other plan over here that could work? That we know y'all ready to fight and we know we could win because we got more force than y'all, but we don't need to do that because We got another trick up our sleeve. Stay tuned. In his impatience, the fact that the colonized subject brandishes the threat of violence proves that he is aware of the exceptional nature of the current situation, that he intends to make the most of it, but also on a more immediate personal level, as he sees the modern world penetrate the remotest concerns of the interior. He becomes acutely aware of everything that he does not possess. The masses, by a kind of infantile reasoning, are convinced they have been robbed. In certain developing countries, therefore, they are quick to catch on to realize 2 or 3 years after independence their hopes have been dashed. What was the point of fighting if nothing was really destined to change? Playing Uno at the chessboard. In 1789, after the bourgeois French Revolution, the humblest French peasant gained substantially from the upheaval. But it is common knowledge that for 95% of the population in developing countries, independence has not brought any immediate change. And any observer with a keen eye is aware of a kind of latent discontent, which, like glowing embers, constantly threatens to flare up again. So you mean tell me, so they'll get free, realize ain't nothing really changed, and then be on the threat of some more uprisings and more violence? Maybe we ain't playing this out right. So they can, so they say the colonized want to move too fast. Let us never forget that it wasn't such a long time ago. The colonized were accused of being too slow, lazy, and fatalistic. Obviously, the violence channeled into the liberation struggle does not vanish, and if by magic after hosting the national colors. It has even less reasons to disappear since nation building continues to operate within the framework of critical competition between capitalism and socialism. So how do we build a nation with no resources, the threat of violence, a constant threat of violence, no allies, no resources? How do we nation build? We are free now, but how do we remain free? How do we become powerful? How do we protect ourselves? How do we build ourselves? So that's why when they're talking about nation building, and we even have to rethink how we talk about it here on this channel. Talking about nation building, we need to think about it and talk about it in the long-term sense of what does, and like Carlton Jones did in this documentary, what does an independent Black nation truly look like? But what does it take? That need to be followed up with. What does it take to truly become an independent Black nation? When every 3 months we learn that the 6th or 7th U.S. fleet is heading towards some coast or other, when Khrushchev threatens to come to Castro's aid with the help of missiles, when Kennedy's envisages drastic solutions for Laos, the colonized or newly independent peoples get the impression that they are being forced, whether they like it or not, into a frantic march. In fact, they are already marching. Let us take, for example, the case of governments of recently liberated countries. The men in power spend 2/3 of their time keeping watch over their borders, averting any threat of danger, and the other third working for the country. At the same time, they are looking for support. Governed by the same dialectic, the national opposition gives parliamentary channels the cold shoulder. It seeks allies who agree to support them in their ruthless endeavor at sedation. The atmosphere of violence, after having penetrated the colonial phase, continues to dominate national politics. As we have said, the third world is not excluded. On the contrary, it is at the very center of the convulsion. This is why, in their speeches, the statesmen of underdeveloped countries maintain indefinitely a tone of aggressiveness and exasperation which normally should have disappeared. The often reported impoliteness of the new leaders is understandable. What is less noticeable is the extreme courtesy that the same leaders show toward their brothers and comrades. The impolite behavior is first and foremost directed against the others, against the former colonists who come to observe and investigate. They come to observe and investigate on this new free nation. The ex-colonized too often get the impression that the findings of these investigations are a foregone conclusion. The journalist is on assignment to justify them. The photos that illustrate the article provide proof that he knows what he is talking about and was actually there. The investigation sets out to prove that everything went wrong as soon as we left. So they're saying, y'all needed us to survive. Y'all needed us to be civilized. We're gone, and look at you, peasants. Look at you, beasts. Look at you, wild animals. Can't rub two sticks together. And the constant threat of violence is keeping y'all on edge. You ain't building nothing. You need us. The journalists often complain that they are badly treated, are forced to work under poor conditions, and come up against a wall of indifference and hostility. All this is quite normal. The nationalist leaders know that international opinion is forged solely by the Western press. When a Western journalist interviews us, however, it is seldom done to render us service. In the war in Algeria, for example, the most liberal-minded French reporters make constant use of ambiguous epithets or portray our struggle. When we reproach them for it, they reply in all sincerity that they are being objective. For the colonized subject, objectivity is always directed against him. We're talking about propaganda, controlling the media, controlling the word, controlling the minds, controlling the masses. Understandable. Two, it is the new tone of which is now dominated international diplomacy in the United Nations General Assembly in September 1960. The representatives of the colonial countries were aggressive and violent in the extreme, but their populations found nothing exaggerated. The radicalism of the African spokesman brought the abscess to a head and shone the spotlight in the unacceptable nature of the veto, on the collusion between the major powers, and above all on the insufficient role allotted to the third world. Diplomacy is initiated by the newly independent peoples. Is no longer a matter of nuances, innuendos, and hypnotic passes. Their spokesmen have been assigned by the population to defend both the unity of the nation, the welfare of the masses, as well as the right to freedom and self-sufficiency. So we have work to do. We have work to do. If we want to become a free nation, a powerful nation, a respected nation, we have work to do. So therefore, we can't just talk about freedom and liberation loosely. We can't just talk about it in a fantastic and a fairy tale way. We have to think about it in realistic terms. What does true liberation for us actually look like in either this Western world or somewhere else? If liberation is truly our goal, what does it truly look like? And we need to plan it out. We need to think about it in the phases of colonialism, anti-colonialism, decolonialism, and post-colonialism. White supremacy, anti-white supremacy, and post-white supremacy. You can put de-white supremacy. De-white supremacy don't sound good, so that's why I say it. But white supremacy, anti-white supremacy, and post-white supremacy. What does freedom really look like? Let me write that down. White supremacy, anti-white supremacy, and post-white supremacy. What does freedom really look like? All right. In 1945, the 45,000 dead at Streif, I'm saying this right, I can't pronounce it, so at Streif could go unnoticed. In 1947, the 90,000 dead in Madagascar were written off in a few lines in the press. In 1952, the 200,000 victims of repression in Kenya were met with relative indifference because the international contradictions were not sufficiently clear-cut. The Korean War and the war in Indochina had already established a new phase. but it was above all Budapest and Suez, which continue the deciding moments of this confrontation. Heightened by the unconditional support of the socialist countries, the colonized hurled themselves with whatever weapons they possessed against the impregnable citadel of colonialism. Although the citadel is invincible against knives and bare hands, its invincibility crumbles when we take into account the context of the Cold War. So let's think about it. In this new context, the Americans can take the role as the barons of the international capitalism very seriously. At first, they advised the European countries to decolonize on gentlemen's terms. In the second phase, they have no hesitation first proclaiming their respect, then their support for the principle, Africa for the Africans. Today, the U.S. has no qualms officially declaring they are the defenders of the rights of the peoples of self-determination. But we know it all comes with strings, right? The latest voyage by Mr. Menon Williamson illustrates all too well the American consciousness that the third world must not be sacrificed. Understandably, violence is a desperate act only if it is compared in abstract to the military machine of the oppressors. On the other hand, violence in the context of international relations, we realize, represents a formidable threat to the oppressors. President Jacqueries and Mau Mau agitation disrupt the economic life of a colony, but pose no threat to the metropolis. A great threat as far as imperialism is concerned is that socialist propaganda might infiltrate the masses and contaminate them. It is already a serious task during the conflict's cold period, but what would happen to the colony rooted by bloody guerrilla warfare in the event of real war? So now we're talking about maintaining resources, maintaining status, and maintaining your dominance over certain areas. Certain third world countries feed the first world countries as far as resources and minerals and riches and all these different things. So we cannot lose these. We cannot have these destroyed. We cannot have these in the hands of other people, because these are the things that we need to survive. So we must find a diplomatic way to maintain control, but at the same time, let these people think that they are free. My mind's playing tricks on me. Independence has certainly brought the colonized peoples moral reparation and recognized their dignity, but they have not yet had the time to elaborate a society or build and ascertain values. Let me read that again. Independence has certainly brought the colonized peoples more reparation and recognized their dignity, but they have not yet had the time to elaborate a society or build and ascertain values. I have never had the time to build ourselves up as a people or self-actualize. The glowing focal point where the citizen and individual develop and mature in a growing number of areas does not yet exist. Situated in a link of indeterminate, situated in a kind of indeterminate state, they have fairly quickly convinced themselves that everything is decided elsewhere for everyone at the same time. As for the leaders, when confronted with such a situation, they hesitate and choose a policy of neutrality. So what is this neutrality? So we are not developed, but we must survive. So as undeveloped people who are now found ourselves free or pseudo-free, how do we survive? Neutrality. So what is this neutrality? There's much to be said on the subject of neutrality. Some liken it to a kind of loathsome mercantilism, which consists of taking handouts left and right. But although neutrality, a creation of the Cold War, allows underdeveloped countries to receive economic aid from both sides, it does not permit either of these two to come to the aid of the underdeveloped regions in the way they should. Those literally astronomical sums invested in arms research. These engineers transformed into technicians of nuclear war could raise the living standards of the underdeveloped countries by 60% in 15 years. It is therefore obvious that the underdeveloped countries have no real interest in either prolonged or intensifying this Cold War, but they are never asked for their opinion. So whenever they can, they disengage. But can they really do so? For example, here in France, they're testing atomic bombs in Africa, even allowing for the resolutions, the meetings, and slammings of the door on diplomatic relations. It cannot be said that the African people had much impact on France's attitude in this particular sector. So this neutrality, this Cold War tactic of neutrality, we will align ourselves with no one, but we will gain what resources we can from both sides without a true allegiance. But because we lack this true allegiance, we're at the mercy of their prices, and we have no real resources still to build ourselves. And if they continue to hike the prices, we have no choice but to pay them or go without. And if we go without, we starve. So we've put ourselves in a position that's not a great position. So that's why you must plan before you fight. For the colonized, this violence represents an elaborate praxis. The militant, therefore, is one who works. The questions which the organizations ask the militant bear the mark of this vision of things. Where have you worked? With whom? What have you accomplished? The group requires each individual to have performed an irreversible act. In Algeria, for example, where almost all the men who called on the people to join the national struggle were sentenced to death or wanted by the French police, trust was proportional to the desperate nature of each case. A new militant could be trusted only when he could no longer return to the colonial system. Such a mechanism apparently existed in Kenya with the Mau Mau, who required every member of the group to strike the victim. Everyone was therefore personally responsible for the death of the victim. That's how we know you all in. That's how we know you ain't no faker. To work means to work towards the death of the colonist. Clamoring responsibility for the violence also allows the members of the group who have strayed or have been outlawed to come back, to take their place and be reintegrated. Violence can thus be understood to be the perfect mediation. The colonized man liberates himself in and through violence. This praxis enlightens the militant because it shows him that the means to the end. So this the presence of violence, the existence of violence, the threat of violence is something that invigorates the people. It incites the people. It empowers the people. It gives the people vision. It fuels them. It allows them to see an end. It allows them to see freedom. But it has to be planned properly. You have to have resources to survive. You have to have resources to not just become free, but remain free. And when we say free, that means economically free. That means politically free. That means minerally free. That means free in every sense that you can think. All areas of human activity, you're free. And you're independent because you are self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency is more than just a slogan. It is understandable how in such an atmosphere, everyday life becomes impossible. Being a fellow, a pimp, or an alcoholic is no longer an option. The violence of the colonial regime and the counter-violence of the colonial balance of the colonized balance each other out and respond to each other in an extraordinary reciprocal homogeneity. The greater the number of metropolitan settlers, the more terrible the violence will be. The violence among the colonized will spread in proportion to the violence exerted by the colonial regime. In the initial phase of this insurrectional period, the metropolitan governments are slaves to the colonists. Those colonists are a threat to both the colonized and their own governments. They will use the same methods indiscriminately. The assassination of the mayor of Evian can be linked to the assassination of Ali Boumendjel in its method and motivation. For the colonists, the alternative is not between the Algerian Algeria and the French Algeria, but between the independent Algeria and the colonial Algeria. Everything else is hot air or an act of treason. The colonist logic is unrelenting, and one is only baffled by the counter logic of the colonized behavior if one has remained out of touch with the colonist way of thinking. Once the colonized have opted for counterviolence, police reprisals automatically call for reprisals by the nationalist forces. The outcome, however, is profoundly unequal. For machine gunning by planes and bombardments from naval vessels outweigh the horror and scope the response from the colonized. The most alienated of the colonized are once and for all demystified by this pendulum motion of terror and counter-terror. They see for themselves that any number of speeches on human equality can mask the absurdity whereby 7 Frenchmen killed or wounded in an ambush by the Sacmodi Pass sparks the indignation of civilized consequences, whereas the sacking of the Gregoire Douars and the Chara, I'm saying these wrong, and the massacre at the population behind the ambush count for nothing. Terror and counter-terror, violence and counter-violence. This is what observers bitterly report when describing the circle of hatred, which is so manifest in the tenaciousness of Algeria. So we're talking about violence and counter-violence, war and counter-war, which Neely Fuller talks about. We are at war, but are we truly ready to go to war where we are here today in America? Because what Frantz Fanon is describing is the realities of going to war. These are the realities of fighting for your freedom. These are the realities of fighting for your liberation against a nation as armed as the U.S. And remember, he's talking about Algeria and France. So we're talking about, if you're talking about freedom and liberation from America, what does that actually look like? What will it truly take for us here in America behind enemy lines to become free? If you're a person who only believes violence is the answer, I hope you have the means by which to answer your question. Because if you don't, you just howling at the moon and wasting people's time. Right? Because you have to look at liberation in a practical sense. What does a liberated Black community actually look like? And what does real liberation look like? And what does it actually take? Are you ready for that? And if not, what do we do to get ready? What do we need to do to prepare ourselves? Because yes, there's a mountain ahead of us, but the idea is not to get discouraged. Idea is to become innovative. The idea is to think outside of the box and take proper action to free ourselves rather than just running off of emotion because we're just so ready to be free. Right. It is understandable how in such an atmosphere, everyday life becomes impossible. Oh, I read that. In an armed struggle, there is what we call the point of no return. It is almost always attributable to the sweeping repression which encompasses every sector of the colonized population. The point was reached in Algeria in 1955 with the 12,000 victims of the Philippeville and in 1956 by Lacost's creation of rural and urban militias. It then becomes evident for everyone, and even for the colonists, that things can't go as they are and have to change. The colonized, however, do not keep accounts. They register the enormous gaps left in their ranks as a kind of necessary evil. Since they have decided to respond with violence, they admit the consequences. Their one demand is that they are not asked to keep accounts for others as well. To the expression All natives are the same. The colonized reply, all colonists are the same. When the colonized subject is tortured, when his wife is eliminated or violated, he complains to no one. The authorities of oppression can appoint as many commissions of inquiry and investigation as they like. In the eyes of the colonized, these commissions do not exist. And in fact, soon it would be 7 years of crimes committed in Algeria, and not a single Frenchman has been brought before a French court of justice for the elimination of the Algerians. In Indochina, Madagascar, and the colonies, the native has always known he can expect nothing from the other side. The work of the colonists is to make even dreams of liberty impossible for the colonized. The work of the colonized is to imagine every possible method of annihilating the colonist. On the logical plane, the Manichaeanism of the colonists produces the Manichaeanism of the colonized, the theory of the absolute evil of the colonist in response to the theory of the absolute evil of the native. Realities of war, realities of conflict, realities of rebellion, realities of revolution. It's not easy. Freedom ain't free. Freedom ain't free. Anybody who told you that you're just supposed to be free. Yes, freedom is an inalienable God-given right. But in this world, in the world that we live in, human history has shown us, yes, freedom is a God-given right, but you have to protect that. And if you don't protect that, you forfeit your freedom. And once you forfeit your freedom, you will be inclined to fight to regain your freedom. But now, are you in a position to truly gain your freedom? And after you gain your freedom, are you in a position to protect the newfound freedom that you have gained? And therefore, your new enslavement, even after your pseudo or so-called newfound freedom, your new enslavement or the new colonization that's imposed upon you doesn't have to come through force. Come through political means, economic means, as Haiti. When it is achieved during a war of liberation, the mobilization of the masses introduces the notion of common causes, national destiny, and collective history into every consciousness. Consequently, the second phase, i.e. the nation building, is facilitated by the existence of this motor needed with blood and rage. This then gives us a better understanding of the originality of the vocabulary used in the underdeveloped countries. During the colonial period, the people were called upon to fight against oppression. Following national liberation, they urged to fight against poverty, illiteracy, and underdevelopment. The struggle, they say, goes on. The people realize that life is an unending struggle. The violence of the colonized, we have said, unifies the people. But by its very structure, colonialism is separatist and regionalist. Colonialism is not merely content to note the existence of tribes. It reinforces and differentiates them. Willie Lynch. The colonial system nurtures the chieftainship and revives the old Marabout conformities, violence, and the practices of totalizing and nationalizing. As a result, it harbors in its depths the elimination of regionalism. It harbors in its depths the elimination of regionalism and tribalism. The national parties therefore show no pity at all toward the Cades and the traditional chiefs, and the Cades are the traditional chiefs. And we're talking about in Africa. The elimination of the Cades and the traditional chiefs is a prerequisite to the unification of the people. At the individual level, violence is a cleansing force. It rids the colonized of their inferiority complex, of their passive and despairing attitude. It emboldens them and restores their self-confidence. Even if the armed struggle has been symbolic, and even if they have been demobilized by the rapid decolonization, the people have time to realize that liberation was the achievement of each and every one no special merit should go to the leader. Violence hoists the people up to the level of the leader. Hence, their aggressive tendency to distrust the system of protocol that young governments are quick to establish. When they have used violence to achieve national liberation, the masses allow nobody to come forward as liberator. They prove themselves to be jealous of their achievements and take care not to place their future, their destiny, and their fate, and the fate of their homeland into the hands of a living God. Totally irresponsible yesterday. Today they are bent on understanding everything and determining everything. Enlightened by violence, the people's consciousness rebels against any pacification. The demigods, the opportunists, and the magicians now have a difficult task. The praxis which pitched them in a desperate man-to-man struggle has given the masses a ravenous taste for the tangible. Any attempt at mystification in the long term becomes virtually impossible. So now you have a group of awakened people. Now you have a group of awakened people. Now you have a group of people who have seen the bull and is working to repel the bull. But you still don't have your resources and everything that you need. So Black America, what are we going to do to put ourselves in the proper position to liberate ourselves and properly be liberated, to properly self-actualize, to properly grow, to properly become a powerful group of people? We have many times indicated in the preceding pages that in underdeveloped countries, the political leader is constantly calling on the people to fight against colonialism, to fight against poverty and underdevelopment, to fight against debilitating traditions. The vocabulary he uses is that of a chief of staff, mobilization of the masses, the agricultural front, the illiteracy front, defeats suffered, victories won. During its early years, the young independent nation evolves in the atmosphere of a battleground. That is because the political leader of an underdeveloped country is terror-stricken at the prospect of the long road that lies ahead. He appeals to the people and tells them, let us roll up our sleeves and get gripped in a kind of creative frenzy. The nation plunges into action of a hungry, disproportionate nature. The agenda is not only to pull through, but to catch up with the other nations at best one can. There is a widespread belief that the European nations have reached their present stage of development as a result of their labors. Let us prove, therefore, to the world and ourselves that we are capable of the same achievements. Posing the problem of development of underdevelopment countries in this way seems to us to be neither right nor reasonable, right? The European nations achieved their national unity at a time when the national bourgeois had concentrated all of its wealth in their own hands. Shopkeepers and merchants, clerks and bankers monopolized finance, commerce, and science within the national framework. The bourgeois represented the most dynamic and prosperous class. Its rise to power enabled it to launch into operations of a crucial nature, such as industrialization, the development of communication, and eventually the quest for overseas outlets. And overseas outlet was, we know, Black African labor. So them pulling together their resources, the bourgeois pulling together their resources, as well as leaning upon African labor, was able. This is how these undeveloped European nations were able to develop themselves. So don't get it twisted. Don't get it twisted. When we're talking about freedom, liberation, real freedom and liberation, it's not for the weak, it's not for the faint. It goes back to the quote the young lady told Professor Carlton Jones, ain't no money in nation building. Short-term thinking, there's no money in nation building. But we're talking about building legacies. We're talking about real freedom, real power, real respect, real resources in the world. So that's where I'm in my reading. The chapter ends on page 63. The total chapter goes from page 1 to page 63. I just read from page 30 to page 63. So that is chapter 1 in Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Let's see. Chapter 2 is Grandeur and Weakness of Spontaneity. That goes from pages 63 to 96. Grandeurs and Weakness of Spontaneity. Next week's video from pages 63 to 96. But you know, what I like about this chapter is it starts off giving us an overview of what violence is, and violence in the context of liberation. Violence in the context of keeping a group of people colonized, and violence in the context of being decolonized. But it also gives the reality of what decolonization looks like. It gives the reality of what colonization looks like. Because this is more or less not just the mindset of the colonized, the mindset of the colonizers, but the actions that come out of these mindsets. What does one need to do to maintain power? What does one need to do to attain power? What are the actual steps that Black America must take to put ourselves in a better position to become a nation, a powerful nation, and not a group of underdeveloped people within a nation, right? Because we talk about having our own as if we can just wake up one day and just take it. We talk about having our own as if it would not come with many different forms of confrontation, but we know violent confrontation is one option, a main option that probably will happen, right? Because we have a lot of rebels and militias and patriots here in America who are America first, right? So what does real liberation look like? Because you got to think about it. When we're talking about military and militia might, talking about the actual military, what they call the ones that go on the weekends, the reserves, the military, the reserves, the militias, the police forces, the sheriff, all these different factions of resistance, of militarized resistance that America has. Have you taken all of that into account? And the political rise and fall that would happen when Black America, if Black America was to free itself, was to become a free nation within a nation. Where will we get our allegiances from, and where will we get our support from? And if we're not planning on that scale, shit, we ain't serious about nothing. But that's why we're here to read. That's why we're here to learn. And that's why we're here to talk and put these ideas on the table so we can learn to get to where we need to go. Because if not, we're just going to be like a dog hollering at the moon, getting nowhere. And 50 years from now, we'll be in the same position, and somebody will be doing the same thing I'm doing 50 years from now, saying the same things. Do we want change or not? Are we serious about it or not? Because if we're serious about it, damn it, we got to get to work and do some real planning. So with that being said, I'm going to end this video, and I'll catch y'all next Monday, or I'll catch y'all Wednesday as I drop my video Wednesday. So I love you all, and make sure you catch the next video coming up. Make sure you like this video. Liking this video helps the algorithm, helps me get some more views. Put them comments in. You know, I want to know what you think. Subscribe to the channel, share it with all the people that you know. Hey, I love y'all. Catch the next video coming up.